when we're talking about reaching people. And what Adrian was just saying is that there's many parts of the country where people aren't kind of hearing from both sides in a way. There's really only one side presented. So, that would mean that there's a whole half of the country that our movements aren't reaching. And something that you've said is that people know when they're being messaged. So there's a danger in some of our messaging work, is what I get from that. And that think tanks and philanthropy-based narrative initiatives, that they often roll out too late, and that they're not really speaking to people that we're not used to speaking to. And so how are you, alongside others, identifying what we can move in the country, and how we can truly ask people what matters most to them in a way that we can hear it?
Um, I think a good place for me to focus might be on just a little bit of definition, what we're talking about when we say narrative. What is that exactly? And where I see some of the hard work that's in front of us to change it. So in my work at Narrative Initiative and thinking about long-term shifts in the ideas that people hold, and the ideas that are popular and the ideas that folks will act on, you hear the word messaging a lot. It almost never comes up in my work. Message is like the least thing to figure out after you have done a bunch of study and strategizing that starts with your audience. Doesn't start with you, but with your audience. If there was one shift I could get all of us to make after this panel, it would be to, when you're thinking about communications, don't start with what do we want to communicate. Start with who are we trying to communicate with? Because we can say a lot of different things in language that works for us. But if we want to grow the base, if we want to recruit more people in our direction, if we want to have on ramps to progressive action, and not just for white people, but for everybody, and not just to benefit people of color, but to benefit everybody. If we want those kinds of on ramps, we really have to stop thinking that we know best how to talk to people. We do not. We know best how to talk to organizers and scholars and policymakers. But in fact, we have a lot to learn about talking to everyday people about real life things in real language, in real talk. And and I think one of the things that our movement really needs to have more of is a way to test how the things we say land on people. We test in real life by measuring what happens when we're on the doors or on the phones or doing a project like this. But there are other ways to test also that, like, um, wealthy establishment groups use, and to craft their messages and figure out how people are reacting to them. And some of those tools, um, we could replicate. Some of those tools we wouldn't want to replicate, but we need to be able to say why. And some of what we learn through our own communications has to move into a feedback loop and a strategy so that other people can use that knowledge as well. Those are all in pieces of infrastructure that we have to have if we're going to change um, the deepest elements of the US story on which white nationalists can find fertile ground. So here's a couple of quick definitions. A story is a description of things that a person goes through. Stories always have characters, stories always have plots, they always have settings. And the idea that's embedded in a story, what we call the moral of a story, that is narrative. The ideas and themes that you are pushing out through the stories of actual humans encountering actual humanity Um, that's the ideas and themes are narrative. And when you have enough stories with the same ideas undergirding them, accumulating over centuries, we call that deep narrative. And what we're up against here is deep narrative. And so you can't bring a message to a deep narrative fight. The gun versus knife fight. In our case, we're like fighting on deep narrative with messages, and the messages are knives. They're never really going to make a deep enough impression. So it seems to me that the beauty of this project is that it it centers the audience and the people that were trying to actually figure out how to organize. And if the conclusion is we can't organize them, then okay, so be it. But I tend to think that no one is truly unorganizable. I've heard people tell me a lot. You can't organize Muslims, you can't organize families that have kids in the child welfare system, you can't organize undocumented people. You can organize anybody if you can figure out how to connect with them. And um, our narrative challenge is to take these constituencies of white folks and separate them from the deep narrative of America as a white country and give them on ramps to some other ideas, which have equally long lineages from the beginning of this country on, but that people don't have as much access to, because this brings me to, I think, my last point. We don't own any platforms. We don't have an OAN, a Newsmax, and a Fox News sort of parroting our stories and messages. So as we work together, I think a lot of what we need to do is figure out what, in fact, how do we talk to real people about real things in real language? That's one. And I so deeply appreciate our scholars, but a lot of what we do is over rely on academic and scholarly frameworks because we're too poor and unwilling to do the work of communications testing and of figuring out how to translate those frameworks into real talk. That's really, it's not that much more complicated than that. Um, so I think what's in front of us is looking at the content and what people are concerned with, but also how are we going to continually test a set of stories that might have some deep narrative function, that might be able to start interrupting deep narrative, and how are we going to get those stories out into the world? What are our platforms going to be? Maybe our platforms are the phones and the doors. I don't know, but those are two things that like none of us would ever be able to figure out by ourselves in our individual organizations. We have to do it through a combination of action and storytelling and really rigorous measurement of how that all goes, so that we're not just continually feeding our own fantasies, that the words that feel good to us, the stories and ideas and themes that feel good to us, are also persuasive to all the people we want to reach and on ramp.